Hello, welcome to the final panel discussion of the EURA conference. When we were actually doing the panel discussion, we had some technical issues that led to the fact that the beginning of the panel discussion was not recorded. Hence, I'm re-recording it so that you will have the beginning before we move into the live recording of the panel discussion itself. But here is the introduction to the panel discussion. So my name is Cecilia Sax-Olsen, and I am a research fellow at the Norwegian Institute for Urban and Regional Research at OsloMet. And I am moderating the discussion. And so at the conference, 2 days of the conference explored this role of contradictions in shaping urban futures. And so in this panel discussion, we will focus on the generative potential of urban contradictions in terms of, for example, promoting social change, developing alternatives to the status quo, and also for searching for more social and ecologically just urban futures. So to frame this discussion, we will focus on the growth versus degrowth debate, which is a very good example, I think, of the generative potential as well as the inherent challenges that contradictions bring to attempts at reshaping urban futures. For those of you who are not familiar with the term degrowth, I just want to first quickly say that degrowth is an idea and a social movement seeking to dismantle the idea of economic growth as a universal good and to develop alternative ways of organizing society in which growth is not central metrics or signifiers. So the challenge, of course, then, is that the idea of degrowth is often misunderstood as kind of the opposite of growth. And of course, this misunderstanding is perhaps no surprise, as the common reaction to contradictions is to try to resolve them by removing one of the terms of the contradiction. So say in the case of growth, then it's countered by its static opposite, which then is no growth at all. But of course, this is a gross simplification of what degrowth is. Degrowth is not the opposite of growth, and it's not simply a material process of shrinking cities and economic decline, or of simply lowering consumption, which of course is a highly irrelevant demand for those people who are already living below limits. Instead, degrowth is a sustained critique or resistance to the destructive and extractive processes of economic growth. So, for example, the ideology of growth is seen to continue these colonial relations with a pretense of generalized betterments, while also at the same time securing resource expansion that only benefits a rich majority of the world's rich minority of the world's population. But of course, already here, degrowth stumbles into a contradiction, because degrowth is a term conceptualized and promoted in the global north, and many people in the global south see it as simply one more intellectual term arriving to them from Europe, and which is insufficiently sensitive to their own realities. Of course, there is a big difference between frugality as a choice and frugality as a social condition. So in order then not to create these new forms of intellectual domination, it's very important for actors that are seeking social change to cultivate solidarity and understanding with other people's struggles and concerns. So when then alternatives to the status quo are reduced to an attempt to counter these static opposites, such as, for example, then growth versus degrowth, there is a risk that these alternatives come to be seen as coming from some kind of realm of freedom and truth that operates outside of everyday realities and the constraints of the present. And then we are stuck in this very common paradox in which attempts to change the world are easily accused for hypocrisy, because these attempts inevitably are still part of how the current world works. So to avoid this paradox, We need a more dialectical notion of contradiction, which means that rather than attempting simply to resolve contradictions by countering these static opposites, we need to explore and question the processes that constitute these contradictions. And this way, we may develop perspectives that enable us to diagnose instances of concrete reality and then generate a desire for intervention and open up possibilities for change. And I think this is very much what this conference has tried to do. But the question is, how does this work in our own research and practice? How do we do this? And this is what we will try to explore in this panel discussion. And with me to discuss this, I have three fabulous panelists that all happen to be human geographers or affiliated with human geography like myself, but that provide different perspectives on urban transformation and change. So firstly, we have Ayona Datta, who was one of our keynote speakers. She is professor at UCL and is focusing her work on post-colonial urbanism, smart cities, gender citizenship, and regional futures. And then we have Karen O'Brien, who is professor at the University of Oslo and does work on climate change impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation, with a specific focus on the social and cultural aspects of change. And finally, we have Hug March, who is an assistant professor at Universitat Oberta de Catalunya, where he does work within urban political ecology, smart cities, urban water management, and degrowth. So welcome to all of you.
Yeah, thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this amazing panel. So a few words about me. I consider myself an urban political ecology scholar interested in understanding how natures are produced and reproduced, or in other words, how nature is urbanized. And while my initial contact with political ecology was through urban water and is still central to my research, for instance, around the debates and contradictions of privatization, remunicipalization, and financialization, I expanded my interest to how urban sustainability was being rethought in Barcelona through the smart city concept. So the smart city was embraced in 2011 in Barcelona by a liberal government, which needed urgently a new urban narrative after some 30 years of socialist-led local government. Under the ambitious goal of working towards urban self-sufficiency and through a rather techno-deterministic, I would say, stance, urban and socio-environmental processes were reimagined through the intensive deployment of ICT. As you can imagine, this process was not free of contradictions. So in the paper, Smart Contradictions, the politics of making Barcelona a self-sufficient city, we showed some of those contradictions at different scales, from the smart building to the smart block, going through also the smart networks. In any case, what we detected was that pursuing self-sufficiency and reducing the carbon footprint of the city through the intensive use of smart technologies may imply an intensification of the dependence on technological providers and displace environmental impacts elsewhere. But that time, I also began doing some incursions into the degrowth debate. As you may know, in Barcelona, we have a powerful academic degrowth community, and I established some dialogues with them. For instance, with geographer and environmentalist Giorgos Kallis, we reflected on how critical geography may contribute to the degrowth debate. By then, degrowth was already a powerful imaginary, but lacked an understanding of how some notions widely discussed in critical geographies, such as scale, network, space, or uneven development, were important to articulate a critique towards the current mode of capitalist development. Degrowth also lacked a reflection on how we should deal with the contradictory character of smart city strategies. And more broadly speaking, degrowth lacked a critical reflection on the possibilities and perils of digital urbanization to pursue more just and sustainable cities. I tried to do that, to review in a paper the contradictions and perils of smart city strategies on questions such as technological determinism, privatization, the politicization of urban issues, or unexpected environmental trade-offs and impacts. But beyond articulating a critique to the smart city, which was necessary in Barcelona at least, I reflected on how a degrowth or post-growth agenda might selectively engage with the smart city debate and use ICT to pursue its own agenda. In parallel, I have followed how the smart city debate has developed in Barcelona in the past few years after the victory of a new left-wing government back in 2015, and how the smart city mutated to transcend some of the initial contradictions of the more top-down and corporate version of the smart city, embracing more progressive views and new concepts such as technological sovereignty, and putting an emphasis on how ICT may deepen democracy and citizen involvement in the co-production of the city. Overall, and to end up with these initial thoughts, the Growth Scholarship, while being permeated in the past few years by critical geography and political economy, still lacks a serious engagement with the urban question, in my opinion. And in this sense, with some colleagues, including geographer Maria Caica, Federico de Maria, and Angelos Barosis, we are putting together a special issue in urban studies, which will gather empirical research and theoretical reflection precisely on that topic. And we'll try to address the following question. What are the new social-spatial experiments, practices, policies, and imaginaries inspired by the degrowth agenda in the global north, but also in the global south, and how we can understand and harvest their potential to transform the future of our urbanization? And with those initial thoughts, I will leave my presentation. Thanks.
Thank you. Wonderful. And I think we will go straight to Iona.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me again today. So I'm not going to repeat any of the things I said yesterday, but I want to give a kind of broad overview of who I am, but also what I've been doing in my work to probably connect to some of these ideas you've talked about today. So I've been introduced as a geographer, but actually my background is as an architect. I practiced as an architect, and my degrees were in architecture, environmental design, and planning. So I very much came from the built environment discipline. And therefore, I was very interested always in understanding why urban transformations, what are the imperatives, what are the things that drive these urban transformations, but also why sometimes urban transformations that are seen as the most marginalizing, most authoritarian, for example, are actually embraced by those who stand to gain the least out of them. What are these narratives and discourses and the representations of these that appear often seductive to even the most marginal citizens who sign up for these, expecting rewards that have never been promised to them in particular. So a lot of the work that I've done in the past has been to see these kind of politics of urban transformations, politics of urbanization, particularly in India and in the global south. And the way that I actually walked into examining smart urban futures is because in the past few years, suddenly in the Indian context, the new mode of transformation became through ICT, through a smart-driven urban transformations. And so that's how I got into smart urban futures, examining its what makes it tick across all kinds of stakeholders and participant groups. And one of the things that I've been finding is that it falls back to old narratives and discourses of utopianism. And we heard from Robert Beauregard yesterday about utopianism, and of course, utopianism has a strong critique in planning disciplines, but it also has its often regenerative discourses over the decades of post-colonial urban planning, where utopianism as in utopian urban planning, mass scale, starting from a so-called terra nullius, has shaped the way that the post-colonial subject or the post-colonial nation state has tried to reimagine itself in a global modern world. And so utopian planning has been one of the key mechanisms and tools for seen to be speeding up to a modernist future. And so the ICT-driven smart urban futures falls quite squarely in that utopian imperative of the nation state. And so yesterday I was talking about how we need to think about this sort of utopian imperative driven by ICT as a kind of top-down policy to become more sensitive to time and temporality, to really see the past, present, and future as kind of flowing in a cyclical sense of time, that the past is often reinvigorated in future planning, in future utopian planning, in a way that the past is not just reinvigorated, but also reinvented to justify these kinds of authoritarian utopian planning initiatives. So one of my key questions in my work has been to ask, what are these future imperatives? Whose future? To what ends? And when and where is the future city, like I asked yesterday? And in that context, I've asked two connected questions. One is the question of what kind of future leads me to the questioning if can we make experiments with both conceptually but also empirically around feminist urban futures. And here I've been looking particularly at the imperatives of the smart city that has been trying to resolve gender-based violence, violence against women in the city. And in India, there's a big concern around that through smart initiatives such as increasing surveillance in the city, increasing CCTV cameras, and actually reinforcing the surveillance that women feel from their families and neighborhoods and communities through actually a city-based initiative of surveilling them and their bodies. And so this is the first contradiction I want to propose, is a contradiction between what currently is the smart, safe city with ICT-driven safety and surveillance, vis-a-vis the feminist imagination of a future of a just city, where justice means democracy, justice means freedom, freedom to take risk of walking around in the city at night, and then of course education, literacy, capacity building, and then of course the kind of transformation of societal values around gender and embracing of gender diversity. Related to this is the question of urban future, because feminist futures leads to just urban futures. And here I'm also, my final point is the arguing for an urban, but also a regional future, where we are seeing increasingly municipalities completely going out and adapting ICT-driven futures for its digitalization of governance, but also digitalization of planning, automated systems, etc. And these urban and regional futures have created a kind of expansion of the territory that is further marginalizing those in the peripheries of the city by through land grabs, dispossession, demolition, and so on, and some of which I mentioned yesterday. So I want to therefore end with this question of where is the future of the city? Where is the future of feminist urbanism or smart urbanism? And I want to actually resurrect perhaps some of the questions of utopianism. And I think utopianism has very rightfully been very critiqued because of its authoritarian imperative. But I also want to argue that what we are seeing now, particularly some of the kind of imperatives at grassroots level, which use both the widely available information age through digital devices, etc., but also grassroots social movements that have reimagined urban futures in an alternative way, as an alternative utopia. And I'm borrowing here from David Pinder's work on progressive utopias, where grassroots utopian imaginations have often been silenced by the state as illegal, illegitimate, dissenting, anti-developmental, anti-modernist, etc. And yet, at the same time, they can radically transform the kind of the rationalist planning visions that also are utopian in a sense, but they are often out of sync with everyday life at street level, at community level, at the domestic level. So I'm making an argument today about grassroots visions of urban futures that are not necessarily against the city. They just have different visions of urban utopias based on citizenship rights, on justice, on democracy. And these visions are often shaped by historic, social, political engagement with the cities, but also a temporal understanding of past, present, and futures. So these are the alternative utopias, and I would say that if we need to look towards degrowth and a kind of sustainable, just sustainable future, we need to think about what are the alternative futures, alternative utopian imaginations that can emerge from the street level. And I'll stop here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Iona, and we will go straight over to Karen.
Hi, and thank you so much for inviting me. This is a fascinating conversation. And just as a little background, I'm a human geographer at the University of Oslo, and my research has really focused on the human and the social dimensions of global environmental change, very much at a macro level, looking at like what globalization has to imply for environmental change and the idea of winners and losers and so on. And I've also been very much interested in the process of transformative change. How does it come about? And this idea of the how of transformation, I think, is really important right now because everybody's using the concept of transformation. And, from governments to businesses to research programs and everything. But what does it actually mean in practice? And I think Cecilia posed that question nicely in the beginning. And the idea that, who's deciding on the transformations? Whose values count, who's benefiting and who's not benefiting becomes a super important thing. And this is where a lot of the contradictions come in. Because, at a global scale, we know that we are transforming the future. We know that we are impacting the atmosphere, the biosphere, the hydrosphere, urban landscapes, and ecosystems, and so on. But when it comes to thinking about social change and questioning those assumptions and being very critical of the paradigms, we tend to be a lot less, we tend to think that we don't really matter as individuals, as groups, as cities, or as countries. And we actually, we can see that we're contributing to risk and vulnerability, but we don't see that we can contribute to alternative possibilities and potentials and things. And I think that's really where it's a really contradiction, I think, is like the paradox of mattering. And this is very much due to our framing of the problem and our framing of the solutions, because we've really reduced issues like climate change down to an environmental issue. Like it's just a problem, an environmental problem, it's a greenhouse gas problem. And what you get then is that, technical and behavioral solutions, they seem to be the most measurable, results oriented. So we reduce people to their carbon footprints, and we start to think that, we just need to shape their behaviors, nudge them, get them to do this or that. And I think that that's really problematic, that we're basically innovating based on the current paradigm to solve a problem that we're creating with the paradigm, rather than actually thinking through, how do you activate that sense of individual agency, collective agency, and political agency for transformative social change? And so with my research group, we really take an integral perspective and look at kind of three spheres of transformation: the practical, the political, and the personal. And really, putting attention, shining light on our own beliefs, values, worldviews, and paradigms. And often when I say beliefs, values, worldviews, paradigms, people will just go, yes, we need to make that into a project to change people's beliefs, to change their values. And I think that becomes super problematic because, again, the question of who's transforming whom is something that, it's a highly political issue. And when it comes to, for example, the growth, degrowth debate, I think we could just take a step backwards and just even look at that language of the dualisms and the dichotomies of growth, degrowth, because it might be a very valid critique of the economic growth paradigm, but it's often interpreted in very different ways of, like stagnation, or we're not allowed to grow and things. And I think if we want to express solidarity, if we want to really get connections with others, we may have to actually have a different type of language to do that. And I think, the type of growth that we're talking about on this planet right now really is an expansion of social consciousness. It's of actually recognizing the relationships and connections. And so to me, if we can shift from seeing environmental issues as just environmental problems, and I even see myself like labeling it environmental humanities, environmental problems, but really looking at them as relationship problems. And then how are we in relation? And that, I think, is, we move away from a right, wrong, and us, other, into this more dissolving the contradictions by actually taking a different approach and generating new patterns and new relationships. And that, I think, is where the critical perspectives that you and Iona have talked about become really important, because it's almost like we're creating fractals of change, new patterns that can actually be replicated at the neighborhood level, at the urban level, and they scale in a very different way than the top-down, bottom-up types of changes that we're struggling with. And that goes into, how do we think about scale when we're trying to, with the temporality that we're trying to activate and generate social change right now. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from. Is like not the whether we can transform, but how, and how can we do it in an equitable and sustainable manner at the speed and the rate and the scale that we need to right now. So thank you.
Thank you so much. What wonderful presentations and openings, and so many places we can go now. I think there's a really interesting link there, what you're saying, Karen, about the how transformation and the relationship problems, and what you were saying, Iona, about that why is it that some of these more oppressive narratives are also kind of adopted so easily by the people who will benefit the least from them? And I think that really what you were saying, Karen, is also cutting to the core of some of that, really, like how are these things embedded within us, and how do they speak to us, and in that way that they manage to have such a big control of our lives, you can say. So I would like now to open a discussion between us on this. If we keep going on this, the idea of scale, and from the personal and to the city, Hug, you were also talking about the question of scale missing from degrowth debate often, and so I was wondering whether you would like to start to you were saying that degrowth lacks an engagement with urban questions, for example. So could you maybe say a little bit about how ideas such as degrowth can open up spaces where transformative urban change can be brought about? And how can we take this kind of forceful critique and transform it into something that can be put to work in contemporary cities?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And in my opinion, I mean, it's difficult to observe real examples of degrowth, really existing degrowth, but what we can observe is the seeds of degrowth and post-growth narratives in many grassroots experiments. I am talking from the vision of Barcelona, which may broadly differ from to other cities, and especially to global south cities. But in speaking from a Barcelona perspective, we can already see the seeds of the growth, and also the concept flowing through many small scale initiatives revolving around urban gardening practices, around housing cooperatives, around interventions in the public space by grassroots to tackle or to renaturalize the city and to adapt to climate change. So I guess that there are many instances. The problem is that they are not that much connected, but basically the problem is that they exist in a kind of, let's say, silos, in a sense that it's very difficult for them to be upscale. Interestingly, we already have some examples of how the degrowth debate is already permeating local institutions, but also regional governments and national governments in some places. So I guess that the value of those small scale examples precisely is to visibilize the concept and to permeate or existing governmental structures, which we see already in the case of Barcelona.
I think what you're saying exactly that about these alternatives, how can we make them flourish? Because right now they are existing on the margin, right? Like not because of current policies, but in spite of them, you might say. And so I was wondering, Iona, if you have any thoughts about how can we make such alternatives existing on the margins? How can we put them in the center? How can we make them flourish?
That's a really difficult question. I think maybe if we take some examples of what is happening, maybe we can start unpacking how. The very short answer to that is there is no one there is no one way of doing it, and each has to be set in its context. Let's say we take one example, which is the movement of slow cities. And there's been a lot of talk about it, but it's something that has come from a very Western context of, things becoming slow, work slower, and, consume slow, eat food in a slow fashion. So kind of stopping time, but also considering time and as a way of enjoying life, as a way of responding to ecological disaster. And that's great. But if you try and take it to a place like India, for example, and try and think of slow cities there, it becomes an elitist movement. So we really need to think about any of these examples as in situ, situated in context. And actually, if you think about any of these ideas, just the simple one is smart cities, something that we've talked about already. Wherever it goes and lands up, it becomes a kind of homegrown narrative. So smart cities also, when it came to India, it came with this big image of what it might do, how it might create sustainable cities, because things could be done really faster. You can stop water leakages, you can stop traffic sort of getting into congestion, and therefore it's going to make things sustainable. But it didn't. So I think there are plenty of examples in which sustainable urban futures have been proposed. Another one recently going around in Europe, which has become a very important and a very popular concept, is the 15-minute city. Now, the 15-minute city has to be proposed because the capitalist system invented the automobile and created expressways and took away public transport. So now we have to go back and initiate a 15-minute city because now everything has to be pedestrianized. And some of these ideas, when they come to India, again, when you start talking about, I'm hearing planners and policymakers starting to talk about 15-minute city and everything has to be pedestrianized, then it turns into another gentrified community. So I think any of these examples, there are so many examples that we can think about. Another last one I will say is the 24/7 cities. Now in India, most cities are 24/7. So as a policy imperative, 24/7 cities, trying to make them in India is a win-win situation. But these 24/7 cities, when you unpack them, what is the gender distribution? So you see in the evening and at night, it's only men out on the streets. It's a highly unsafe city, even in the daytime, forget about evening. So again, I think any of these imperatives cannot be seen in their own kind of abstract, objective way. They have to be argued and negotiated and balanced in situ with both the kind of social, historic, political context there.
Thank you, which is, exactly what I was going to talk about next, is this tendency of urban managers, as you were talking about, to kind of be fixed on these models of best practice and these kind of ready-made templates for action, which are then brought from context to context, which is, like you were saying, that it's a tendency that is happening a lot. You find a model and then we do this and then we put it there and then we put it there and then we put it there. So these kind of universal and uniform visions of good cities. And then I wanted to ask you, Karen, what are your thoughts on these kind of universalizing cities, and how can we, as Iona was talking about, how can we create a more situated practice of change, if you like, within the urban context?
That's a great question, because I think that, like, when we talk about cities, there is a universalizing, like, urban this or that. But when we talk about citizens, the people who live in the cities, then context becomes really important. And I think that, to move away from this like cookie cutter approach, a replication approach to scaling, do something that is much more organic, that comes across as feeling quite small and irrelevant right now, but it's actually, I think that it's almost like what Anil Khoury calls like an infrageography, that it's all over the place. It's these patterns that are everywhere in neighborhoods, and they're emerging, but they're not part of like the narrative that we're being sold. And they're actually, so it remains a very hidden geography, but I think it's also very powerful. But if we continue to just thinking about scaling as like, wow, we have to take the smart city and put it everywhere, or we have to take the green city or the clean city or whatever the buzzword is, that then we actually lose that capacity for all these changes, that transformation is happening everywhere. And it becomes a lot about that challenging the mainstream discourse, but also launching alternatives that have existed for a long time. And I think with generative, you come to regenerative, bringing back what worked, rather than just like what Iona, like clearing the slate and starting as if we have to start from scratch. So I see a lot of potential, but I feel like it's really untapped into, because we're almost like we're seeing things like this rather than seeing the patterns that are coming up, and also seeing what's stopping those patterns, very skillfully within, and in a seductive way. It's being used to to maintain the status quo rather than transform it.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think, yeah, exactly this thing about the clean slate that we've been talking about a lot, like from your keynote also. Yes, Iona, and which brings me then over to also what you were mentioning, Iona, about utopianism, this. The Robert Beauregard in his keynote yesterday was very clear about his keynote being an anti-utopian talk that promoted reform rather than revolution. And also, as you pointed out, Iona, that this, I guess, mirrors also a more widespread rejection of utopian thoughts in urban studies, which is understandable if we think about this clean slate critique, which, utopianism has often been seen as this idea of just creating a clean slate and escaping the present and build something fantastic from scratch, from the clean slate. And I mean, if we think about architecture, I think this thought is still very much prevalent in the way architecture is now built on often like a clean slate, where you focus on the iconic building and so on. But back to the idea of utopia that you were talking about, Iona, which was more kind of an optimist idea of utopia, which is more a way, not as a kind of blueprint for the good society, but rather as a way of critiquing the present and insisting on the possibilities for change, which I would say is important if we're talking about social transformation. And so I would like to ask you, Hugo, because you mentioned you wrote this article about the utopianism of degrowth, and in that article, you're actually using science fiction as a way to explore some of the aspects of degrowth that would be maybe harder to understand now because we don't have a fully realized degrowth world. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how can you explore alternatives, like, for example, degrowth through science fiction? What is it that science fiction can do within this context?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I fully agree. First of all, just say that I fully agree with what Iona said about utopianism before, so I would not add much on that. But concerning your question, Cecilia, using science fiction to reflect to criticize, but also to reflect on the potentialities of degrowth as an imaginary to subvert the current system, actually was not my initial idea, was the idea of the first author, Giorgos Kallis, but we saw that a book that maybe you know, or but if you don't, I recommend the reading of it, is Ursula Le Guin, The Dispossessed, served quite nicely to articulate a critique upon the lack of a critique and a reflection upon the spatiality of degrowth. So I'm not going to go through the book, but the book basically presents two different worlds, Anarres and Urras, and precisely shows the contradictions and the tensions between both, but also shows the possibilities of one of those two worlds, Anarres, if I'm not wrong, which apparently to all of us will look like a dystopia. But even in that kind of dystopia, there were the seeds of change and transformation. And we also wanted to reflect on that through the lens of David Harvey's concept of spatiotemporal utopianism in his book Spaces of Hope, which is not probably one of his most cited books, but we found very interesting and appealing arguments there, and basically it serves us to understand that the growth as a kind of utopia should not be a kind of blissful end state, as precisely as Iona said, and probably because I was not in the keynote yesterday, but of course utopianism has received a lot of criticism and probably at some point well deserved in urban studies, but seeing utopia as a kind of using utopia as a kind of tool to imagine a future of process and conflict instead of blissful end state was productive in order to think about the spatiality of the growth. And science fiction precisely gave us a kind of example of how degrowth may look like, just how may look like. It may look like in many other ways, but it was a nice entry point to make that discussion.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, it's interesting, like you said, I think like the revelation of the main character in that book, which is Shevek, is not when he is in the one world or the other world, but it is when he travels between them. And, you know, like when he uses the non-capitalist world to question the capitalist world and the other way around. So it's not in the either or, but it's actually in this in-between state that he has the revelations about his life. But Iona, I was also interested then because it made me think of that book actually and science fiction yesterday when you were talking about this time of future presence and future past and cyclical time and all of that, which is actually what Ursula Le Guin, the author of this book, says, that because she's writing science fiction, she's always kind of accused for writing about the future. And she said, I never tried to write about the future. We have nothing but the present tense. So that made me think about how all of these different layers are interconnected. And I wonder if you see also yourself any links to science fiction when you think about these time lapses.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, certainly, I think science fiction is a reflection of society and society's ways of thinking about the future. I mean, if you look at science fiction films from the 1960s, we've moved even beyond that. And there were many architectural movements which were trying to build up upon these science fiction work, like the plug-in city and, you know, all of these kind of interventions that were thinking about this calamity. And science fiction sort of relates to present calamities in a way of thinking about a future responding to those, like the oil crisis, like nuclear holocaust and things like that. So certainly, and science fiction enables us to think about the past, think about the future through what's happened in the past and the present. But, you know, coming back to what Karen and Hugh was talking about with utopianism, I think utopianism is also a kind of fictional narrative, but it can be, if we detach it from its really close association with a built environment and architecture planning imperatives, the ideas of utopianism can be both progressive and regressive and authoritarian. I mean, it's like a concept. Democracy is a utopian concept. How it plays out in practice may be very different, same as justice. And so if you think about, you know, science fiction also being a sort of utopian progressive critique of the past and the present, then certainly there is a lot to learn from there. And I'm talking about science fiction also in a way that we can see from science fiction how it thinks about feminist futures as well. You know, how does it respond to gender relationships between the protagonists and antagonists and so on and so forth. And if you think about, again, utopianism, feminist urban futures is kind of utopian thought. What we are doing is we're thinking about, you know, positionality, reflexivity, and a self-critique that can enable us to constantly critique our own imperative ideals about justice and democracy and strive for the better. And utopianism is just that. It can never be completely fulfilled. It's always it's always a kind of a blueprint for the future, but it's never always complete. It's always in the making. And in that sense, it can be architecture, but it can also be a thought, a practice, a way of living life. And so it can be both progressive and regressive.
Yeah, and this made me think about, I think what you're saying, that it never being complete and also leaving space for self-reflection, which I think is so important also when we talk about change, and like you were talking about also whose future are we talking about, and all of those questions. And I myself been working quite a lot with arts as a way of providing this space of self-reflection. And I know, Karen, that you have done that too, worked with artists and so I wondered if you could say a little bit about why do you think that the arts and creativity are important tools to use in transformation processes, for example?
Yeah, and I think it follows up very much on this idea of science fiction and tenses and things. And we're looking at like the conditions that will really enable transformations, and creativity is one of them. So is empowerment, so is collaboration, and so is flexibility of narratives. And I think that idea that in some ways we tend to think of the future in a very deterministic way, at least when you just, drag the climate projections into the future and you say, oh, we have no chance of avoiding a 2-degree warmer world and everything, but what is the potential right here and right now? And so I think that sense of like the future conditional is really important, because it is conditional on what we do. And working with artists, they are generative, they're not innovative. It's like they're actually generating new ways of being right here in the moment. And I think that's where, like, we put out a call for short stories called Our Entangled Future Stories, short stories to empower quantum social change. And was so great because there was a lot of researchers that submitted short stories, and they opened up. They weren't these utopias that were perfect. It was like, what is it? What does sense of smell feel like in a world that has been transformed? How do we relate very differently? Like it was really about that potentiality. And we're actually having some webinars of the readings, and I can share those with them. But it was really kind of inspiring, but not in this like naive utopian way. But it was about what is the potential right here and right now to do better. And that, I think, is where we're at right now, because we know that we're going to be losing things. We know that it's not going to be this like idealistic future, especially in the next 10 years. And so how do you hold on to that? But really start to not just like talk about like sustainability as this thing that will happen in 2030 or 2040 and 2050, but bring it right here, right now, and say, okay, well, how can we be generative? And I think artists, we're so much in our heads all the time, especially as academics, that we're trying to convince people and explain and things, but there really is like the heart. If you can actually get the heart in the hands engaged, and that's why, like that idea of, presenting things metaphorically, lyrically, musically, any other way than just as an academic text, I think that has a lot to offer. And so, it's really, I think we are all creative in that sense of we can generate a change right here and right now. But the issues that come up on equity, on justice, on history, all those things are, they're there right here and now.
Thank you. Great. There's so much potential that we can use. I see that we are starting to run out of time here, but we've gotten a question from the audience that I would like to read up for you. This is from Mariken. She says, thank you for a fantastic discussion. Reading some of Hugh's text early in my PhD studies, I always wanted to be positive towards the subversive potential of smart technologies. However, in my case study, the Smart City project in Stockholm, what I increasingly see is a lack of citizen engagement in smart city narratives and a growing acquiescence, hard word, with techno-solutionism and surveillance. It seems, at least in the Swedish or Scandinavian context, that the narrative that the city should be optimized and fixed through ICT developments, increased control and cooperation with private actors is largely being accepted. So I am wondering, these grassroots utopian visions challenging contemporary social orders and rationalities, are you seeing them as rising or declining today? And where can they be found? And how should we as academics engage with these in productive ways? And this is a wonderful, I think, final questions for you, because I also was wondering also about our roles as academics to engage with these contradictions and challenges. So I don't know who maybe you would try to start answering, since she's referring to you, and then Iona and Karen can supplement.
Yeah, thanks for the great question. Actually, it doesn't have an easy answer, and again, I will talk through my experience through the Barcelona case, which may broadly differ to other geographies, as Iona pointed out. I do think that it's in the smart city narrative itself, and how it is being embraced or rejected by grassroots, always bears this tension. I mean, there is always a tension between how smart city technologies may be transformative, and I will put just the example of one single, but probably the most important, let's say, a smart city. They won't call it a smart city, but it's a kind of a smart initiative born in the smart city paradigm, which is the platform Decidim in Barcelona, which is something that was not developed by the city council, but was something developed through an European project, but which landed to Barcelona, but which was embraced by a kind of technological grassroots, and then they came up to produce some kind of open source platforms, whereby governments, but also kind of cooperatives and other kind of institutions may establish and enhance digital participatory processes. So, for instance, I guess that the CDIM would be one of the most clear examples of a kind of progressive use of ICT in a kind of cooperative way, I would say, between some grassroots and part of the local administration, because at the same time, we don't have to see the local administration of a city as big as Barcelona as a kind of monolithic. I mean, in the city of Barcelona, there are visions that embrace corporate smart city politics, others that fully reject it, and others that go beyond the concept itself and aim to use other narratives to talk about digital urbanism. But the CDIM project, I would guess, is one of the nice examples where you can see some progressive use of ICT, not just by top down, but by grassroots.
Yeah, Iona, would you like to add something?
Yeah, if I can add to that, this is a really, really interesting point, and something that has been very challenging in research as well. And I completely agree with you. I mean, we've all heard the Decidim project. It's a brilliant initiative, and I think some of the South Asian countries also want to adapt that imperative. The question again is, I think, the context. I mean, in a context like India, where there's a huge digital divide, it's going to be harder and harder for people to, for the state citizen to interact in that same way through portals like Decidim, although they have been trying very much. And so some of the citizen engagements that they did in the smart city, and this was the first time they did it, it was very progressive in that sense that actually citizens were asked to contribute to the state's initiatives. But the people who actually contributed to these were people who were already empowered enough, and they had these digital devices, and they knew what they were doing. So actually getting into the platform, knowing your way around, finding the place to contribute to and write your comments. So what we are seeing though with the digital, and this is why we have to really ask the right questions, you know, and somebody was saying, you know, smart city is the answer. What's the question? The question is the big thing. I mean, what are we trying to resolve? Why are we having, you know, why are we moving all the face-to-face citizen state engagements to a digital platform in a context where the public sphere is already dominated by upper middle classes, upper caste, you know, majority religions, and men, of course. And so in India, it has been really, really difficult. And the last one I wanted to say is in one of our projects, we also found that even when young women living in the slums and squatter settlements, they have a mobile phone. Most of them have a mobile phone because they're very digitally savvy. They still do not know how to contribute, how to actually speak. And when they speak, and we saw this in the context of the Me Too movement, when they speak, they are really shut down. They face violence even in the digital sphere. So some of the relationships that we see between state citizen and citizen in a public sphere, in the public spaces, is what is actually translating and transforming into the digital space as well. And so that's, again, something we need to bear in mind when we propose solutions that are seen to be transportable easily across the world, but they are set in such complex societies in different contexts. We really need to understand how and why we make the space possible for women or marginalized people to be able to speak in their own voice, tell their own stories, and be heard and acknowledged.
Great. We are now at the very end. I wanted to hear if Karen had something you wanted to add. If not, then we will say thank you to all of your contributions.
I could just add that I'm sorry that I fell out. It was technology that failed. So my smart computer just collapsed. So it speaks for itself as a final note. Thanks.
Yes, and let's just say that I really hope that we will be able to meet in person on the, because as nice it is to have you guys on the screen with me, I would have loved to be in the same room as all of you and also the audience. There is a different, if we talk about relationship problems, Karen, I think there's a whole different relationship going on when we can be physically present. So let's cross our fingers that the next conference will be physical. And with that, I would like to thank you so much for your contributions and your time. It's been really wonderful to have you, albeit on the screen. So thank you. And now I want to give the word to Valeria and Susanna to wrap things up.